Is multi-club ownership the next big challenge on football's horizon? Are governing bodies opening the door to sporting compromise in terms of their flexibility? It's all come about because Brighton and Aston Villa are going to be able to play in Europe next season, despite their owners having ties with other clubs. Basically, they've both got interests in other clubs and they've had to dilute their shareholding because UEFA has then allowed them to participate, providing that the linked clubs do not transfer players to one another, either permanently on loan, until September 2024. When, in the case of Brighton, for example, and Union Saint-Gilloise, who play in the Belgium League, they have been transferring players up until this point. They have been loaning players up until this point.
You saw the Pozzos do it for years of Udinese and other sides
absolutely.
of Watford.
What was the other one? Girona.
Correct.
Yeah, they were just basically circulating players between the three, weren't they?
Forestieri.
In fact, there was another player that went there recently and they paid a lot of money for and then loaned him straight to Watford. It was a very odd situation.
I know what you're talking about, absolutely.
Yeah, raised their eyebrows about that. Let's talk to Ronan Evain, the Executive Director of the Football Supporters Europe. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I know that you were in Manchester a couple of weeks ago. I was at your conference at that started at the Football Museum in Manchester with the UEFA General Secretary Alexander Seferin, and you also had Debbie Hewitt there, the chair of the FA. I was sitting in the audience that night listening to you talk about a variety of different things, but multi-club ownership is certainly on the agenda, especially for UEFA. Are they doing the right thing here?
Well, they're doing the right thing, the least damages with the current state of their regulation. But what we see is that a number of multi-club ownership structures are currently testing the regulation of UEFA, but also at domestic level, testing their rigidity, how they can hold against new types of ownership structures. And what we need at UEFA level, but also at domestic level, is a reinforcement of current regulation in order to protect the integrity of the game.
Why? Because ultimately, those who own these clubs will turn around and say that they're helping raise the profile. Some of these lower clubs, for example, if you look at the Royal Saint-Gilloise situation, it was never going to compete in the Champions League until Tony Bloom came along.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, yes, they've been successful, but I don't know if it wouldn't have been the case with another owner. There are two threats to the game there. One is about the identity of what is football, what is a football club, the fabric around it, the community around it, and the other one is about the integrity of the game, the integrity of the result. Now, if next year AC Milan is going to play against Toulouse, which is another example of two clubs allowed to compete in the same, potentially compete in the same European competition next season, how are we exactly going to feel about the result? How are you media going to cover those games? How are the fans going to feel about the integrity of the results? This is really an existential threat to football, because this is about the integrity. It's about how we can trust what's happening on the pitch, and how it is or it is not influenced by non-sporting elements.
Is that a little bit dramatic, an existential threat to football, or is it actually Ronan coming up with that assumption because of the fact that football itself gets itself into these situations and causes problems?
I think he's right to some extent in what he's saying, because it puts itself in the way of a debate about the integrity of a situation, with one side maybe having less motivation in a game to win it because the undue influence that an owner might deploy over the outcome of a particular game.
It's all hypothetical.
It's hypothetical, but it brings into question, and what Ronan is advancing the notion of, why does this question need to be here in the first place? The problem is, when you've got a globalised world of immense wealth now that are buying football clubs, they want to do things in a different way. I've never been of the mindset, and I don't know if Ronan has an issue with this, if you're not in a situation, I opened Crystal Palace in USA, it was never going to compete with the domestic games that Crystal Palace played in the UK, so we were never going to come across one another, and I saw it as an opportunity to be able to open the doors to developing talent abroad, playing it abroad, and also opening a talent pool to bring back to the UK.
Well, arguably, Brighton might have thought that they were in that situation until they got to the stage where they're now competing in Europe.
And then what Ronan would advocate for, I suspect, without putting words in his mouth, is that's the nature of the beast. You now have to reverse out of your position. What Tony Bloom will be doing is doing a proxy situation. With all due respect to Tony, he'll reduce his majority shareholding down and perhaps put somebody else in as a proxy. So it's a ridiculous notion. But we are now in a situation where the genie's out of the bottle. Manchester City have been doing it for some time. Chelsea are doing it and going to be doing it. Other clubs, and I suspect Newcastle will follow suit, because it's a model that you are going to emulate. I've never understood the idea that the game should have less regulation the more money that's in it. The more the money is becoming so huge, the less regulation over agents has been over the years. Now it seems to be less governance over football clubs. Ronan, are you comfortable with the idea of multi-club ownership if they're in different parts of the world that don't affect one another commercially in terms of the sporting integrity of the game by playing one another? Are you relaxed about that sentiment?
It surely has less of a negative impact or potential negative impact on the integrity of the game when it's the City Group owning a club in England and in Brazil or in the US. Now, when it comes to the impact on the fans of the clubs involved, it's also not an ideal situation. And I know that coming from an English perspective, the English clubs are often at the top of the pyramid. So for a fan of Man City or Brighton or Aston Villa, it doesn't make much a difference whether your club is involved into the club ownership structure or not. Now, I'm joining you from France, and we are close. I think it's a matter of weeks or months before we reach the time when 50% of professional football clubs in France are owned by multi-club ownership structures, and except for Paris Saint-Germain, all the others are second, third, fourth tiers in those structures. And then, you're being a bit stripped away from your club. I mean, yes, in a few examples of relatively well-run clubs, multi-club ownership structures from a sporting perspective, but there is also a growing number of zombie clubs. If you take a club like Nancy, that used to be Michel Platini's club, at the moment they effectively don't have management, they don't have anyone investing any money in the club, and they are going down to fifth or sixth tier. So this is also the reality of multi-club
But you mean
ownership.
your initial premise, and I understand the relationship that fans may have with clubs that are being treated in a certain way, but the initial premise that you started with, which is the bigger argument, which is about sporting integrity, why is it that the argument is being advanced by football supporters but not being advanced by the football structure itself, i.e. other clubs and the authorities themselves? Why do you feel that you're the voice that needs to be heard and the football voice that is ultimately the one that's compromised more in terms of the commerciality of certain things is not particularly present?
I think there's a bit of wishful thinking from a number of stakeholders in the game saying, the players or the coach will always do their best to get the best possible result, and certainly true in a number of cases. But if you are, we're talking about the audience, the people that bring money into the game, the fans. If there is the slightest doubt about whether the result is again influenced, what happening on the pitch is influenced by outside elements or interest or not, then that's when it's an existential threat to football, because if we can't believe what's happening on the pitch anymore, then people will stop watching football. That's exactly what happened in countries with a high level of match fixing. This is a different matter than match fixing, but in the end, from a fan's perspective, the impact is the same.
And there is no such thing, Ronan, is there now, of a club not competing with any other team because of globalisation, because ultimately we're all in line for competition for talent, but also because of the Club World Cup, ultimately there is now always, no matter where you are, a potential that a club can meet another club. And imagine you get into a situation where you get into the Club World Cup, Manchester City are there, and for whatever reason the draw just works out that in the end they meet in the final against Melbourne City or New York City.
Well, this is the challenge that football has.
What happens then? Because could you imagine Manchester City have to win that game because they're the ones at the top of the pile.
But this is the challenge.
And that's what Ronan's saying.
I know precisely what you're saying, and I concur with it to some extent. And this is the challenge that football's going to have to rise to. It's either going to rise and recognise that, as Roland advocates for, it's an existential threat to the integrity of the game. It's going to have to accept that it's a multi-global, and it's going to be challenged. Believe me, if Manchester City and teams like Manchester City want to challenge the authorities and push the envelope and test the rigidity, to use Ronan's expression, about the laws that are in place at this moment in time, they will do. And it's about what it is that you can do to be able to combat that. That may well mean, to give your example, the FIFA World Club Championship. If you've got a club participating in the FIFA World Club Championships that's part of a multi-club ownership model, it gets excluded. But then you'll have a situation where...
And then what's the point?
Well, it depends upon how keen you are to maintain the integrity and structure of the base of football. FIFA can't have it both ways. They can't start muscling in to domestic tournaments and make it their business when they're an international federation, and then start suggesting that there is not a challenge here by having globalised world, multi-ownership with different football clubs, and potentially bringing the game into a part of jeopardy. So I agree with what you're saying.
Is the answer here, the only answer, Ronan, that we go back to the old days and strip it back, and if you've got an interest in one football club, you cannot have an interest in another?
I honestly can't imagine another solution as a response to it. It was said earlier that the more money, the more interest there is in the game, the more regulation there needs to be. I mean, in arguably the most competitive sport in the world, in American sport, you have a number of safeguarding mechanisms that don't allow hedge funds or sovereign funds to invest or to be in a capacity to control a sports club. I think that's what we need to look into. It's not an acceptable situation as is now to have a situation when potentially Saudi Arabia is controlling or has minority stakes in X numbers of clubs in Europe, and we can't even know which those clubs are. How many football fans in Europe at the moment don't even know who is the ultimate owner of their club? So again, this is about integrity of the game, but also the connection with your club. It's hard to relate with your club when you don't know who owns it, when you don't know
So who's taken their eye off the ball here? Who's responsible for this?
I think football governing bodies at the domestic, at continental, at the global level need to put an end to this inflation. It's probably already too late. There is the chance to limit it, but they can't be complete open doors. The decision from UEFA is the risk is that it opens the floodgates. Those clubs have tested the system. They found a new opening. There was a loophole used by Red Bull 10 years, 15 years ago. Now it's another type of loophole that's been used, or another type of opening that's been used by those clubs. How many other multi-club ownership structures will see the opportunity to invest into European clubs and to have European clubs competing in the same competitions? I think we are entering potentially a new era of European football.
And I think that's right. And I think there was no preparedness from the governing bodies of football to understand the global impact, or more to the point, the enormous might and financial resources that some of these people had.
Because they were asleep.
Well, asleep, unprepared, not understanding the consequences of it. It's like suggesting that people should have been prepared for what Roman Abramovich was going to happen to Roman Abramovich. No one could have priced in that Roman Abramovich was going to be sanctioned as a result of an invasion of Ukraine. So that the idea that Roman Abramovich, which to some extent started this hyperinflation in football and this change of direction about the commerciality of football and football clubs can become, started small with Jack Walker, and then it morphed into Roman Abramovich, then it changed into Sheikh Mansour, and all of a sudden now it's a game that's a very different dynamic. So I think it has to be watched, but I think the genie's out of the bottle. I think there's going to have to be a methodology to allow what's currently going on, but tighter regulation about how this looks and feels, and if there is one whiff of impropriety, then there are consequences as a result of it.
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.